Sydney Brownwood.
Good evening and welcome to this TooFatLardies Oddcast. Once again, we're back in the Holistic Studio, beaming our message across the stars, and I'm joined by the Obi-Wan Kenobi and Darth Vader of Wargaming, Nick Skinner and Richard Clark. Gentlemen, welcome to the Lard Star. May the Force be with you.
There's Obi-Wan, Ben Kenobi. One Ben Kenobi. There's Obi-Wan, Ben Kenobi.
Next verse.
Hello. Sid.
Hello.
Give us a Darth Vader song. Do you know any?
Yeah.
Yes, hello, Sydney. Delighted to be here with you, seeing your beautiful face peering back at me from my Zoom screen. It's a delight.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's been a while. It's been a while. I was just saying to Richard the other day, it's been since almost early June since we were last
I know.
doing podcast.
How did that happen? That wasn't intentional, was it? I think we just went so frantic during the early part of lockdown, and we recorded like 3 or 4 shows in pretty short order, and then I think after that we just exhaustion hit.
Well, the thing is, because we haven't had any shows to go to. Often the shows are the anchor around which we build our content for podcasts, aren't they?
And
because we've got Lardy days coming out of our ears in the summer. And
the fact that we're stuck in a car for a couple of hours, and it's a good time to, record our thoughts and comments. So yeah, you're right. It's what do you talk about in the hobby when you're not doing the hobby?
Well, we're about to find out.
I mean, I think we've all been doing things over the course of the last 3 months, course of the summer in the UK anyway. But I thought what we could start off with was really discussing the world of wargaming in general, what we've been up to, and what's been going on in our lives of Lard and lives of wargaming generally. So, fire away, chaps.
What have you been doing, Rich?
I've been building. I've been doing a lot actually, and it's all a bit random, a whole lot of everything. I don't know how, but everything's rather happening at once at the moment. Good old John Savage up in Harrogate started doing some work on some Wild West rules based on the water tanker model, which all of a sudden I found myself building a load of Wild West buildings and painting some of the fabulous Foundry Wild West gunfighters, which there's so much selection on their website. I've just got a load of civilians through which have arrived. I got some really nice, unusual buildings from Sarissa, which I was pleased with, because what I don't want to do is just fight the, gunfight in the main high street. And I'm very keen, and John and I have talked about this, he's very keen as well, for the rules to present more of a world rather than just one high street, one main street. So I've been building some really nice buildings from Sarissa. So things like their mine head, the big tall, great big, about 18 inches high head of the mine shaft type building with the gear in for dropping them down. And I've been building, excuse me, some blacksmiths and a wood yard. What's the word? Not a wood yard. A wood sawmill. And building from like a ghost town and things like that. So really, some really nice bits and pieces that I've been doing there. And I've just got a load of Sarissa roof tiles, like the wooden shingles that they do, those sheets of card, which I've been finishing those off with today. So they're going to get undercoated tomorrow.
Have you buying more new cowboys, or bringing life into your old ones, your old Foundry ones you had? Have you got those, or have you got some new ones?
No, I've got some new ones. I've just had a look, and I bought my original cowboys years and years and years ago. I think they were Guernsey Foundry at the time, and that really dates it back to the 80s. And I looked online and I thought, wow, some of those new ones look really nice. When I say new, they're probably 20 years old, but they're new to me. So I went ahead and got them, and I'm looking at sprucing up some of my older ones as well, because I actually did them up. If you remember when we had the general election night game, which was based on Cowboy Town, and the politicians were cowboys and the electorate was zombies, which was a really kind of a very political evening we had on the night of the general election, playing a rather foolish game. But that was very tongue-in-cheek and very good fun. And I spruced up some of them then, and actually painted some of them up and converted some of them with a bit of green stuff to look like some topical politicians at the time, some of whom are no longer around, but some of whom still are. So that was quite fun. So I've enjoyed doing that. I've also been making up some really nice buildings for Carthage. And I'm just at the point now where I'm sat here painting some pots and bits of scatter to put around those buildings, and even some magic carpets, mate. I bought them. Well, not magic, they're carpets, if I'm honest. They're 3D printed carpets. So these flat roof buildings can look really quite funky with a carpet on the roof. And the detail is nice and proud, so you can just dry brush it to get the good look.
If the carpet's on the roof,
yeah,
what's on the inside?
Wallpaper.
Right. Okay.
Stupid question.
So well, they're going to look great, aren't they? Well, I just wondered, but it's going to look good. I've seen those 3D printed rugs for them. They look nice, actually. They're good. So much little scatter now available in 3D.
They're one of those crazy things that you pick up on eBay for £4.50, £5, and with a bit of postage, £6.
Yeah.
And so I just picked up a load of stuff for scatter. So that I thought, like, I picked up some amphora and bits and pieces like that I think really convert what can be fairly ordinary MDF buildings into something that bit prettier, because you're adding a bit of detail to it.
Amphora, are they like daffodils?
Yeah, very much so, mate. Yeah.
Okay, good. I just want to bring the intellectual level to the right point. I've been like you, Rich. I've been buying lots of little stuff on eBay as well. eBay's been really keeping me going through this kind of last 6 months or so, buying just little bits and pieces just to tickle my fancy as we go through.
Well, I've been buying up another project, What a Focker.
Yes.
Which was First World War aerial combat, and I've been buying up just about every Wings of War, Wings of Glory aircraft that still exists in the world. So I'm building up the European 144 scale aircraft mounted, which I will release on the market and crash the whole economy apparently at some point with the number I'm buying. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with all of them, but yeah, I'm buying loads of them. Been working with Martin at War Bases to create some flight bases for that game, which will fit those models, which is going to be really handy, which he's doing because it's a hexless game. So I've been doing a lot of filming for Infamy. I've filmed 6 in the series so far, and I've just spent the last 5 days filming one game, having a nightmare trying to manage all the cameras and then do all the editing. And because I'm doing all the cameras, I start editing it and think it's finished, and then I think, oh my goodness, I didn't do this, or I forgot that, or I did this. And you think, right, I'm a bit like a one-armed paper hanger, you know, running around the whole time, and you find yourself focusing too much on getting the cameras right and not getting the detail of the game right, which is slightly frustrating. But I'm nearly finished on that. I should have that finished tomorrow. You know what it's like when I do a video of a game, I think, oh, I forgot that bit and I forgot that bit. But I'm really trying to get this one right, because I think putting that caveat on there, oh, I should have done this, is just not good enough. So, but getting things right takes a lot more time than my usual slapdash approach. But there's a lesson learned there, maybe, Clarky. Don't bother getting it right.
So What a Focker is the game that may have been previously recognisable in some shape or form as sort of Algae meets What a Tanker, isn't it, to some degree?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, that's not wrong at all. Although I have to say that the more I've gone through it, the less it looks like Algae, and the less it looks like What a Tanker. But no, it uses flying dice instead of your, activation dice.
Flying dice.
Flying dice. Well, we all know about them on large TV, mate. We've seen a few
Yes.
dice flying there.
We have duck out the way of the flying dice. So you have flying dice. So it works in a similar style to Water Tanker, same
Yeah.
hand of dice to control the ship. And we've
Yeah.
done the same with John's Water Cowboy, or whatever
Yeah.
we're going to call it,
Yeah.
whatever he's calling it. This idea that you have the same hand of dice, and on a 1 you can move your gunfighter. On a 2 you can spot your opponent. On a 3 you can aim at him. 4 you can shoot at him. So it's really quite a direct relative of Water Tanker. But so I'm going to have some interesting things around the side of it about how you develop characters and campaign games, we think. So really excited to do some more with that. We had a fun game with Big Nookie the other day.
Yeah.
My henchman.
I had a chat with John for about an hour this morning where we were talking through some of the feedback from last night's game, because I unveiled it at the club last night. Now, there's a bit of news. We've gone back to the club for the last 3 weeks. Yesterday was the 3rd week in a row, and probably based on the fact that we're only going to be able to have gatherings of 6 people the last week in a row. So we're going to have to decide how we do that going forward. But it has been great to get back into the club. And we've had a couple of games of algae, as we call it, which is water focker. And we played Wild West Gunfight last night. It was my first time running the rules. So naturally, it was an utter disaster, because having played 6 or 7 games with John and Charlie over Zoom, I naturally thought, I can do this, but I really hadn't paid as much attention as I thought I had. So it was a learning curve for everybody, me in particular. But it is good, because John's really developing an excellent campaign system, including my reputation builder, which involves you rolling some dice to see what your character's reputation is before the campaign starts. And we've had some really quite hilarious results coming out of that, which has kept me more amused than it should have done.
Yeah, well, it's got to be fun, hasn't it?
That's really what we're here for, mate. Bit of fun.
Yeah. So you've been a busy boy then, haven't you? Really, doing all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, man.
I've been getting a fair bit of painting done. Some more stuff. Guess what? Around Market Garden, more stuff. More plastic paras being made and vignettes being built and jump-off points being constructed. I really enjoyed doing the plastics. I love the modelling. I'm getting more and more into my model maker hat during lockdown. Work slowly and quietly to create new things from old Tamiya kits or from Warlord kits, or a combination of the two, to make some jump-off markers. Sort of the paratrooper who's dragging his wounded comrade to safety as a jump-off point looks really good. I made some airborne engineers for US Airborne out of all kinds of bits and pieces from the bits box. As you build up with these things, it's been good fun to do that. We're also doing, and I don't know if you saw this, guys, on Twitter. I know you're tweeters. If I say hashtag Brunswickers to you, you won't know what I'm talking about, do you? But
I do.
Know the guy. You do. So a guy on Twitter, Stephen in Australia, who tweets under the handle of Old Wargamer. I can't remember what he posted now originally, but he posted something that had a photo of the Osprey Brunswickers book on it. And I said to him, "God," I said, they look nice. It just makes you want to paint some Brunswickers. So we laid down a bit of a challenge between us over Twitter that said, why don't as many of us as we can buy some Brunswickers, paint some Brunswickers during September and October. I've always fancied doing some Brunswickers, completely off topic from everything else we've been working on, but I thought it'd be a nice departure to do that. And I thought, because I'm such a lazy, sneaky sod, I thought, actually, I'm not going to paint the whole battalion of infantry. I thought what I'd go for was a group of Brunswick Hussars for sharp practice.
Nice.
So I've gone for some front rank Hussars, which look lovely. 8 figures, of course, in a unit for sharp practice. So 8 figures plus a leader, so that's 9 figures. And I reckon I can manage that. I reckon I can paint 9 figures during September and October, and hopefully make them look quite nice. And there's a few people joining in the challenge, so it's not too late to do that. If you want to join in the Brunswicker challenge, hashtag Brunswickers on Twitter, whatever scale, I guess whatever period you want as well, really, although we were thinking Napoleonic. But if you've got anything at all, we don't care. Just hashtag and join in the fun. We're just trying to create a bit of activity, really, and keep some interest going.
I've always fancied doing, and I have actually, but I did them in 15mm, some Black Brunswickers for 1866, because they're so different to the other Austrians and Prussians and whatever, and they're really nice to paint because you spray paint them black and put pink faces on and they're done. In 15mm, but yeah, there's an interesting challenge painting black uniforms, but if you get it right, they can look absolutely stunning. And I think cavalry is the way to do it. I mean, they're going to look really nice. I mean, I know the Prussians in their black hussar uniforms always look superb. So that'll look great. I did think about it, but I've got so much on my plate to paint. I've just got all my Carthaginian and Numidian figures through, and my Roman Roman figures for the Punic Wars. So I've got so much on my plate, I can't join you in that apparently fun challenge, much as I'd love to.
No, it'll be good fun. So yeah, lots of stuff is going across the painting table quite slowly, but making progress nonetheless, and lots of modelling going on. You know me, I'm a modeller, right? What a great model I make. Sydney, you've been a busy boy, have you? What have you been doing?
I've been busy. I've been doing things in different scales. So yeah, lockdown's been a very productive period in a steady sort of fashion. There hasn't been sort of any tremendously late nights, but not commuting every day. I've been able to spend a lot more time on the hobby. So mainly things relating to the early modern period. So in 28mm, just been steadily working through units of French cavalry, units of French foot. I've done a baggage train and brought a couple of things over. Just finishing these off over the last couple of days. These are from Colonel Bill's, and they're very nice. They're sort of MDF wagons with exchangeable different wagon loads, and
oh, really?
Horses are quite. Try and get the lamp on that a bit better.
Nice. I need some wagons for the Wild West. You know, the type of bric-a-brac that you chuck in the streets to make it, break up the terrain. So that's interesting that they do them with the loads on.
Yeah, so you put together very nicely. There's loads for artillery, but there's loads for sort of farm produce and hay and fodder. And I've been making up a series of my own little carts, scratch building stuff, and same sort of basis with a few carters. And so I got started at about half a dozen of those. Those have been very good.
Get Carter.
I took a diversion onto war bases. Never a good idea in some respects. I bought myself some war wagons, a bit more Eastern European-y. So I've got 3 war wagons to do, which I'm going to sort of change round to be imperialist wagons rather than Hussite wagons. I thought they'd be quite fun. They're about £8 each, but they look to be going together very nicely. I've got in the other room, I've got one which I've made up. I've bought a load more stuff relating to the actual figures themselves, 28mm figures. I hadn't bought many of those for a while, and I restocked at Dixon Miniatures and War Games Foundry. But I've also been doing some 6mm stuff. I did with Per Broden, who's been doing a 6mm challenge, very similar to your Brunswicker challenge. Per and Pete Berry at Bacchus sent round some 6mm figures for about 40 people to paint up for a charity challenge. So I've done those, essentially been Per's alt historical Great Northern War Russians. So I did some of those, and they look quite nice when I'd done them. So I hadn't done 6mm for a while, and they were very easy to paint, very enjoyable. So I sent those on to Per. And also I've been doing 2mm stuff, so partly my own and partly with a friend of Lard, Mark Backhouse. So on my own stuff, I've done a set of another smaller set of 2mm terrain boards. These are for the sort of 30 Years' War and also the French Fronde. So I thought that the boards I had were fine, which we used for Lutzen, but I wanted some more flexible ones. So I've done about half a dozen smaller boards, which can interchange and intersect in different ways. I might get the camera out for that on another podcast, because I know we were going to talk about terrain at some point. That was very enjoyable. And then I got carried away, and I made up something which I posted on the my blog last week, all about trying to adapt the sort of idea behind the old Games Workshop game Mighty Empires, whereby you had a series of hex tiles and you fit them all together, and it's an infinitely variable sort of campaign tool. You can, instead of drawing maps or producing maps, you basically have a series of hexsides that you put together and fit together in a different way. and with, well, I've done 50 of the tiles, or I've done 30, got another 20 to do, you can have a fairly variable set of hexes which go together at the start of a club night, so you can quickly do a pre-campaign before the actual game on the tabletop. And I thought that was a really fun thing to do, miniaturizing everything down to 40mm hex tiles. So I finished that last week, and that's something very different to do. It's terrain, but not the normal terrain that we've been doing. But I've also been doing more of the 28mm Flemish buildings. Those have been great fun. And I saw you tweeted, or you posted, emailed us today, Nick, about the Flemish sort of German clock tower that you bought on eBay. And that looked really, really nice. And that set me thinking again, as a new project, a clock tower from my sort of Flemish.
Oh, nice.
Stuff would look very nice.
Yeah. Well, you could have got that one off eBay, but I beat you to it, mate. Sorry. It's just a nice standalone clock tower. Makes a nice little central feature to a village. Breaks up the skyline. Perfectly suitable for sort of Flemish, as you say, Flemish, Dutch, German, whatever. You could get away with it in France, I guess.
And that breaking the skyline is really important with a smaller table. If you've got a big table and you've got tons and tons of space, that's the place that you could use the large church or the expansive village. But if you, like a lot of games that we've been talking about, are on the smaller scale, smaller size as regards the number of units being used or the number of figures being used, if you like a large skirmish, having a clock tower which clearly has height but not necessarily a big footprint is a great way of creating scale. You can pack a lot of buildings height-wise into a smaller area, but you still get the sense that it's a town or a village.
Very much like Charles Grant used to do with his 7 Years' War stuff, where the footprint was relatively small, but the height was slightly exaggerated to give a feeling of a built-up area. And visually, I think that's superb. I tried to do something very similar with my imaginations, my 7 Years' War imagination, Freikorps, and sort of pseudo-Austrian army. Because I just wanted to go back to that 7 Years' War classic look, and I think it can work really well. Got some nice churches in that, because they do give that height.
And I think terrain and making terrain and different ways, not just of physically making the terrain, but different ways of putting terrain together to create really interesting games. That was a topic that I think all three of us were interested in returning to in a future Oddcast. Rich, and I think one of the things that we've been talking about for some time is doing a Nodcast all about terrain, not just making terrain, but actually using terrain, different types of terrain, and how we can use our wargaming terrain to create really interesting, visually attractive games. But that's not for today. That's not for today, because for today we've got a different topic as being our big issue. There's been a fair bit of buzz around the hobby of late, and there's been a lot of talk about a subject being put over and put forward by our friendly chaps at Little Wars TV. All of us, I think, have watched the Little Wars TV videos and we're big fans of the guys over there. They put out a great show, and there's been lots of fantastic games that they've done, which I know all of us have enjoyed. But I think one of the things which has caught our attention over the last week has been 2 videos that they've produced on the subject of, is historical wargaming dying out? So the Little Wars guys have talked to a whole raft of what we would call hobby insiders to get their views, including game designers, store owners, podcasters, influencers, to use a very modern term. And as big issues go, I think the future of the hobby, the historical wargaming hobby, must probably be one of the biggest issues of it at all. Now, chaps, I don't know about you, but I always enjoy the stuff that Little Wars produce, and I thought I'd begin by asking you, did you see their piece? That's probably the first place to start.
I certainly did, yeah, I did, and I thought it was interesting, and it is a question that comes up time and time again. In fact, I remember, when I first started in the hobby, seeing exactly that question. Well, not so much a question, but more of a statement in those days, being in the letters pages saying, we're all doomed. So it's not a new question, that's for sure. But it's, I think it certainly is a question that needs asking.
You're familiar, but what might have not been so familiar with the video piece? Did you see the Little Wars TV piece we're talking about?
Yeah, I did. I saw it. I can't remember who drew my attention to it, but I enjoyed watching it. What's good about that particular piece is firstly, actually, they talk to some really interesting people, and some of the faces I even recognised from both sides of the pond. And secondly, it's nice and short, so that fits in. There's no reason why you couldn't watch it. It's only a few minutes long after all, isn't it? But it's thought-provoking nonetheless. And this idea of where the greying of the hobby. Well, I'm certainly greying, and the people that I see around me are greying, but I don't see the entire hobby, and so it's really interesting to try and get some views from others on this to see really how other people see this, and is it something that's true? I mean, greying, is it necessarily a bad thing? I mean, society in general is greying. It's older, older consumers. Generally have lots. Is a marketplace that lots of industries are desperate to reach into. So actually, a greying hobby is potentially good for businesses in the hobby if it's giving them loads of people that they can engage with, and the older generation have more disposable income, etc., etc. But actually, is that short-sighted? The future is with the young people. Are we seeing young people come into the hobby? Are we seeing young people playing historical war games? And even does any of that really matter? So the whole debate about it's really interesting, and one that I know that many podcasts have tackled over the current weeks as well. It's a bit of a hot topic, isn't it?
Well, I think that's all true. I'd agree with all of that. I think it is a hot topic. I mean, what struck me watching the Little Wars TV pieces was whether intentionally or not, the people they interviewed tended to be the same sort of demographic. They were generally 40 plus, if not 50 plus for most of them. And I did wonder what response we'd get if we asked a younger audience. And to that end, I sent out Richard, our own Richard Clark, to talk to some younger gamers from the Lard community to get their views. So, Richard, how did that go?
Well, I think we're about to find out, Sydney. Like you, I thought that's really interesting, but I wonder what the young people that we speak to on a regular basis, and we see at Lardy Games Days, and we see at other wargame shows and events, I wonder what they think. So I decided to take my magic microphone and, by the powers of Zoom, transport myself to talk to two people on opposite sides of the Atlantic, both of whom, by coincidence, are called Andrew. So we have Andrew France in the United States of America and Andy Crow in the United Kingdom. And I thought it would be interesting to let them do the talking while we just shut up and listen to the voice of the youth of today. Well, here we are. I'm joined by Andy Crow. Andy, you're based down in Bristol, in the western part of the United Kingdom. Can I ask, for the benefit of the tape, how old are you?
I'm 33 and just over a half years old.
Right, okay, fine. You're still keeping that diary, are you? 33 and 3/4. Right. Okay, good. And can I ask, when and how did you start historical wargaming, specifically the historical stuff? So if you did other stuff first, good, we want to know what it was, but then we want to know how it...
Well, if it's historical wargaming, it was really the very start of January 2018.
Right.
And that's when I came down to Bristol Independent Gaming, having felt the urge to get back into the hobby.
Yeah.
And there was some bloke called Rich Clark doing a game of sharp practice who saw me standing on the sidelines and said, "Do you have a game? Do you want to get involved?" And the rest, as they say, is history. So it's all your fault, really.
I hadn't anticipated that response, to be honest with you. I presumed, because I do recall that, that conversation, but I thought you were a sort of regular there, but you weren't, were you?
No. So it was pure happenstance. So,
right.
To give the full background, I guess.
What on earth? Yeah, go on. Start at the very beginning. It's a very fun place to start.
Well, I think like a lot of people, I started with Games Workshop when I was a teenager at school.
Right.
And I played a bit of Warhammer 40k. We had an art teacher who kind of benevolently let us push not very well painted and put together models around his art tables on a lunchtime. And I kind of fell into it that way. And I guess I did that most of my teens whilst I was at school. But then once you start to get into sixth form and you get a job and you discover beer and you can pass yourself off as 18 and start to head down the pub, kind of fell away, really. I've always maintained the kind of interest in it, and I've had friends that have kind of continued it, but the Games Workshop stuff didn't really appeal. And I was, when you were kind of asked about coming on to do the interview, I was thinking back, really, and I thought my first kind of interaction with historical wargaming was one of my school friends bought some Black Tree Design Soviets and paid them up. I'm like, that's incredible, because it hadn't even occurred to me that this was a thing. When I thought of wargaming, I thought Games Workshop, because that's all you would see. It was the high street presence, and didn't have the kind of presence of mind to think of kind of typing it into the internet. You know, I've always been interested in history, but, you know, big interest in World War II and other periods as I've got older. But the thought of being able to combine that interest in history with gaming was a revelation. But in my early 20s, you know, straight out of university, again, was kind of moving around. I had various jobs, so I was all over the country. Never really had the chance to kind of get into it. It's always been there at the back of my mind. And it was only when, 2018, I lost my job, actually. I was made redundant. Fortunately, I found a new one quickly, but I had about a 6-week period in between jobs where I had a bit of money in my back pocket from my redundancy payment. So I thought, sod it, I'm going to get back into gaming. And as I say, it was pure happenstance that I'm based in Bristol. I typed into Google, you know, Wargaming Bristol, and Bristol Independent Gaming showed up. So it's a really great venue. You've mentioned it on the podcast before. They've got a shop, they've got a gaming area, lots of space. And I'd known about TooFatLardies for a while. Again, I can't remember exactly how, but it must have been about 10 years ago, because I signed up to your Yahoo group.
Right.
And I wasn't playing the games, but I knew about you guys as historical war games rules writers, and it appealed, and everything I kind of saw and read. I even bought a copy of Bag the Hun back in 2011 because I thought it was something I could do solo at home. The rules ended up sitting in the drawer, never did anything with it. But yes, it was pure, you know what, sod it, I'm gonna go down and investigate. And it just so happened there was a sharp practice event on, run by David Hunter. You were there. I was kind of in that slightly socially awkward way, and I purely, you know, was quite happy not to play. It was just great to kind of see you, because again, pure happenstance, on my YouTube feed, the videos you did with Beasts of War came up.
Right.
And actually, that was the big driver that, you know, that looks amazing. That looks such good fun. You know, I've wanted to do this for ages. I'm just going to bite the bullet and do it. You know, I've reached a point now where I don't matter if it's cool or not. You know, it's something that I want to go and do, and I want to get back into.
Right.
So it was a set of fortunate circumstances, I guess, that led me to historical wargaming. But I think even if you hadn't happened to have been at big, I still would have wanted. I knew that I wanted to play Chain of Command. I wanted to do World War II gaming. I knew that there was warlord figures that had the range. You know, I'd done a bit of my research, so it was a nice confluence of circumstances that, I guess, bring me onto the Oddcast today and introduce me to you. But yes, it was definitely something that came back over time.
All right. Yeah, it's interesting. That is very interesting, actually, and it isn't, as I said, it isn't the answer that I thought you were going to give. But I always think that there are very few people who actually say, today I'm going to go out and find a hobby. I think a hobby finds you. So what happens is you might see something and it triggers something in your mind, and you might not do anything about it immediately, but you think, oh, that looks interesting. And then maybe a few years later, you see something else and you go, oh, that's that thing I saw. And that looks even more interesting. And then eventually you get into a situation where you end up having a conversation with somebody and they say, come and have a game. And in this instance, it was me, which is hilarious because I hadn't realised that. Okay. So next question. We live in a world where it's, you know, possible to play games without leaving your home. You can link up with people online to play just about any game you want to. So what appeal does a historical war game with figures have that will coax somebody in their 20s or 30s away from their computer and get them going out and playing that game in face to face, because it's a lot easier to remain anonymous, isn't it? It's oh, sod it, it's hard work to meet new people. And I'm a gregarious, vivacious person who likes meeting new people, but it's still a pain in the arse actually thinking about having to go and do it. It's fine when it happens, but actually getting off your backside and saying I'm going to go and meet a load of new people is sometimes not that easy when you can remain at home anonymous.
I think that to throw a spanner in the works, I think it's a slight misnomer to say that you do anything different for someone necessarily in their 20s or 30s to someone in their 40s or 50s. I think that there are perhaps specific hurdles in the way for younger people sometimes, just related to the point that they are in life. But wanting that social interaction, or just making people aware that, you know, historical wargaming, pushing some toy soldiers around the table with a historical theme is a thing. It comes down to visibility. You know, like I said, 16, 17-year-old me, which is a while ago now, admittedly, just could not comprehend. And I think that it's interesting looking back to perhaps the Little Wars TV stuff that's prompted this. And if I could put it this way, that perhaps the next generation that are kind of looking back and thinking about it, I get the sense that for people of an older generation, it was much more visible. The hobby was much more visible. And by that, I mean specifically, you know, airfix and historical wargaming. When you fought wargaming, you fought historicals. Whereas now, for people of my generation and younger, if you think wargaming, it's Games Workshop.
Yeah, no, funnily enough, I mean, I bought my first Wargames magazine when I was 11 in 1974. And games, and within a couple of editions, there was an announcement about a brand new shop that was opening in London called Games Workshop. And it was just a little shop that you'd see on any grotty bit of the high street. And it, you know, and they weren't developed. I don't think they were selling their own products at the time. They were selling other people's stuff. So you're right. And as I got into the hobby, it was just the time that Dungeons and Dragons was crashing onto the scene. But excuse me, but very much the norm was, for my generation, was we were that airfix generation, and we got those historical figures, and consequently when we went to the school library there were books on wargaming, and they were about historical wargaming, they weren't about fantasy wargaming. That came in later. So I think that's very different. I mean, one of the things I was going to ask you about is that people of my generation got into wargaming, historical wargaming, when they were at school because of the situation that I've just outlined. That demographic, that market is cornered now by the sci-fi GW brand, very much. Now, I think, interestingly, and I was going to ask you what you think. What do you think? Who do you think? What do you think is the current demographic that's going to find historical wargaming attractive? And I think you probably already answered that, but I'll ask you again. What is the demographic that, if we as a hobby are looking to recruit people or looking to find people who are waiting, like you were, for this fabulous hobby to be put in front of them, what's the demographic that you think we should be aiming at?
I don't think it's any demographic, Rich. I think it's all. I think it's much more on visibility. So I think that you're inherently going to have people who are interested in gaming.
Yeah.
And for a lot of them, all they will think and can associate with gaming is that Games Workshop or sci-fi or fantasy product.
Yeah.
So I come back to my point about visibility. Yeah. And I think that's the real key. I can only speak again from my own experience, but we'll be down at Bristol Independent Gaming. The majority of people there were playing sci-fi or fantasy games, but we get people coming over to look at what we're doing because we put on a good standard of table. You know, we're laughing when we're playing the games rather than looking really furrowed brows, and that, you know, we're fortunate that we have a good little lardy community there. We're all quite like-minded guys and girls, you know, and that's great. And I think that people, because it's never crossed their mind, and you know, there's nothing better than seeing a well put on, high standards, you know, but it's like everything for us. It's you know, it's the eye candy. So that's both in person, in your club, in your gaming venue, but really online. I think that there's a massive opportunity with, and that's why I think the stuff that like the Little Wars guys are doing is so good, because I think they're trying to explain what historical wargaming as a hobby is. Now, that might be a bit different to my hobby or your hobby. You know, we don't all have a bespoke clubhouse with a whiskey bar, as nice as that would be.
I don't like whiskey, actually.
Well, there you go. I'll drink the whiskey on your behalf. That's fine. You can stick to the cooking.
Thank you.
But, you know, when I look at, say, a lot of my friends who aren't into historical wargaming, they'll play board games. Board gamings have a huge resurgence.
Yeah.
You mentioned Dungeons and Dragons. Role playing's had a huge resurgence. There's you know, Twitch, so is a streaming service. So very, very popular to watch live streams. I know you guys have done a bit of live streaming on YouTube. But, you know, people will sit down
and
and
we
watch.
Accidentally went pissed.
Well, yes, but it's very entertaining. But, but there's a channel called Critical Role. I'm not a role player, but it has 1 million subscribers on YouTube, and they will broadcast a group of quite attractive 20, 30 somethings from California, but they all have a love of Dungeons and Dragons, and they will play role playing live and for 4.5 hours, and hundreds of thousands of people watch it live. And how can we start to harness some of that? Now, it's a bit more difficult for wargaming because there's more setup. But, you know, you can't just all sit around a table and point a webcam at you. There's a little bit more of a setup required. But why can't we start to stream some games?
It ain't that much more of a setup, is it? It's not that much more of a setup.
No, and I think, again, the stuff that like you did with Beasts of War on tabletop, you know, there's other YouTube channels. That's great, and that's a really good start. But I think it's embracing that shift towards online. You've got to go if you want to attract that younger audience. The younger audience is online.
You watch the Little Wars TV thing, which, as you say, I mean, I have to give credit to those guys. The stuff that they've done has been really impressive. What do you feel? There was a comment on there by a good friend of ours, Jay Arnold from the Veteran Wargamer podcast, who talked about potential barriers to entry. Now, you said lack of visibility, but do you think there are other potential barriers to entry for young people?
I think specifically for young people, you've got to think about upfront cost, and that's both monetary cost but also time cost. You know, if you want to reach a certain standard of gaming, you know, it's not as simple as just, okay, I'm going to turn up and play my game. You got to, well, I'm going to buy my models.
It's not the same.
Models of the plastic. I'm going to paint them. I'm going to assemble some terrain. Again, I'm really lucky. We've got Bristol Independent Gaming. I've not really had to worry about terrain. And actually, I think that's a big point. You know, space. I live in a rented house, you know, but I don't really have a huge deal of space here. I don't have space for a gaming table or anything like that. So having that venue has really enabled my gaming. And I think, you know, unfortunately, it's not easy to say, just go out and set up your own hobby space and model shop. But I think there's an interesting transition. We're starting to see more and more of those types of venues cropping up. And, you know, there's a huge resurgence in board game cafes, for example. It's not quite the same thing, but again, people looking for those social spaces where they can go and do a communal activity.
I think you're right. I think there is a potential crossover if we accept the fact that we are gamers. And whilst we do the war end of gaming, you know, there are spaces available and there are communities out there who are into gaming, bigger gaming. And some of those people will pick up and play historical games if they're introduced to it. But they probably won't specialise in it. It probably won't be something they do all the time. But they could, for example, and at the risk of sounding like I'm doing a Lardy propaganda thing here, they could paint 40 figures and play sharp practice, couldn't they?
Yes.
So, you know, or 40 figures and play Chain of Command. But so the demographics of the people, that the group that you game with at Big, you've mentioned the fact that there are a lot of people there playing fantasy games. What sort of age range do they start from? Are you getting the teenagers, or are they all in the Games Workshop shop, and the people coming along are 20 plus, post-university type of thing?
Generally the post-university at Bristol Independent Gaming. They do have some ties with some university groups,
right?
But it's the wrong end of Bristol to the universities, if that makes sense. But definitely, I think that there is a core of kind of people in their 20s who are very familiar with that Games Workshop universe and really like it. Will come and happily play and are really invested in that. And I think that's a good sign for wargaming as a hobby as a general.
Yeah.
In general, because we can, there's something there. Now, it might be that history is not for them. That's great. But, they're clearly interested in playing some games.
Yes.
And, it's finding what they're like. We've done, so we've been playing Kiss Me Hardy recently with the Warlord Games Black Sea Ships.
Yeah, lovely.
That was really cool. What's that? You play, and again, it's just, it's something that bit different.
Yeah.
I have to, I'm a big believer in, that I'm not particularly interested in that type of gaming anymore, but I take my hat off. At the end of the day, we're all pushing toy soldiers around the table. Mine is just as silly as theirs, whether it's an alien, an elf, or a bloke holding a Lee Enfield rifle, it's a game at the end of the day. Now, I like history in my games. I choose to play TooFatLardies because I want that tactical challenge.
Yeah.
But if someone's playing bolt action, great. That's just as good. It's just as good as someone playing 40k. And
yeah, of course, absolutely. I mean, I think the important thing is that people play games that they enjoy playing. It doesn't matter what it is, and then that me, and I'm not precious about. I would never be critical of any game system at all. As if people are enjoying it, it makes it a good game.
I think the other thing I'd say about it's not a barrier to entry so much, but I think that the historical end of the hobby, and partly just because of the economics and the fact that it's a lot of cottage industries, but I think that there is still that lag in tech savviness, and it's got better, definitely, and I think TooFatLardies is a good example of that, but still websites selling models that don't put pictures of the models on them.
No, that's crazy, isn't it? What year are we in?
The e-commerce not really working. You have to send them an email. And I get it. It's people often doing it as an extension of their own hobby.
Yeah.
And there's some very big companies that are really leading the way in this, and yourself doing a great job. But it's also partly around the culture, and I think sometimes I got WSS magazine the other day, and there's a advert of a scantily clad lady wearing a hussar uniform. I don't think that's specific to young people, but it's about the image that the hobby gives off. You've done it before around being welcoming and inclusive, and I couldn't agree more. Because if you want someone, stereotypes exist for a reason, right? And the more that any little thing is in there that kind of perpetuates that stereotype, it's harmful. And I don't want to open a can of worms around PC, and it's not about that, but it's fundamentally, is that something that you'd want your teenage kids?
It's whatever we do in the public sphere is we are in the shop window of the hobby, and is what we're doing something that is going to reflect positively or negatively on the hobby? And I think that's a very valid point. And I think one of the things that we all need to be aware of when we are representing the hobby in a public arena, and that includes in magazines, is ensure that if a parent of a girl or a boy who's interested in, teenage girl or boy is interested in coming into the hobby, if the parent looks at that, would they say, this looks really good? Or would they say, oh my good Lord, this does not look really good. This really looks like it's something that you shouldn't be getting involved in. Now, I do think that's a real issue. And I know that's something that Sydney wants to talk about, because he's just about to release a huge range of naked lady figures. No, I'm lying, sorry, but clearly not. But yeah, I know that's something we want to talk about, so it's really interesting you touched on that. So can I ask you, from your perspective as somebody who's relatively young, younger than me by a country mile, but relatively new to the hobby, and has come in the way that so many people do come in now, once they've got established in terms of where they live, what they're doing for a living, got the degree out the way, and have actually got a couple of quid in their pocket, which helps, whether you're playing golf or wargaming or becoming an alcoholic. You can't do any of them very effectively if you haven't got any money. Would you say, from your perspective, that historical wargaming is dying out? And that's purely from your perspective.
No, not at all. I think that one of my reflections on the Little Wars TV video was, I think historical wargaming is changing, and I don't think it will be. But I think all gaming is changing. You know, that's the natural process of life, right? I don't think you're necessarily going to get a huge resurgence of serried ranks of Airfix Napoleonics being pushed around by you know, happy teenagers. That's probably not going to happen.
No.
But I think that there's a real space in, say, board game crossovers. I think, again, this is something Games Workshop do really well at trying to tap into that board games market. It's so it's, you know, board game with some miniatures that is replayable in different ways. So, you know, they've got their equivalent of like a Commando Raid. Well, where's the World War II Commando Raid version of that? To start to bring people into the hobby, and I think that's where we're a step behind other areas of wargaming. You know, because let's face it, they have more financial muscle.
Big time,
and can take that risk, but they're willing to take that commercial opportunity because they're doing it because they recognise it expands the hobby for them.
Are you pleased you made that jump into it?
Yes, definitely.
Pleased you took it up, right?
It like I said, it's something that, you know, 16-year-old me would have wanted to do, and the only thing is that for a variety of circumstances, I didn't do it before.
You didn't.
I was primed and ready to want to do it. I think the challenge for us is taking those people that perhaps aren't quite so keen, but maybe have a passing interest and show, you know, and it comes down to that fun factor again. You know, that's what your videos with Beast War were so good and so compelling, because you were both clearly having the time of your lives playing that game. And that is how you will draw people in, because they will be watching something else on Beast War about some board game review, or some other game system. It comes up next in their algorithm, and you go, oh, that was really good. And almost like, regardless of whether it's a historical war game or not, you know, it's a fun game. It's a fun hobby. So I'm getting much more out of it because, you know, I'm really into the history, and you know, it's an opportunity to go and buy a shelf load of books on obscure topics I never really knew and wanted to learn about. I've started Kriegspieling, you know, with you guys. It's been fantastic. It's really opened my eyes to lots of things, and it's and I've made some really good friends out of it who I wouldn't have met otherwise. So it's been fantastic.
Well, that was great talking to Andy in Bristol, but now, by the incredible powers of Lard Magic, I'm zooming across the Atlantic and just can see the coast of Pennsylvania looming ahead. And as I come into land on the outskirts of historic Gettysburg, I'm joined by Andrew France from Lard America, who's going to be talking to us about exactly the same subject.
Well, here we are, and I am talking to a gentleman who has appeared on the Oddcast several times before as the voice of roving Lard America, reporting from HMGS conventions across there, Andrew France. Andrew, welcome once again to the Oddcast. And you know, we've had a lot of conversations talking online and on social media about is historical wargaming dying out? And of course, the people being asked appeared to be a load of old gits, when in fact I thought it would be good to talk to some young gits. So we thought that you could be the man to ask, because we've obviously met when I've been over at Historicon, and we've talked about you know, the hobby in general. But tell me, whereabouts you're based, how old are you, and how did you get started in historical wargaming, specifically historical?
Sure. Well, and thank you again for having me on the Oddcast, Richard. Certainly without the in-person shows here due to the COVID crisis, it's been far too long since I've had the privilege of being on here. But I'm sitting in my historic home in downtown Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. A native of Pennsylvania, lived in Virginia and California, but currently in Gettysburg, where I work for the National Park Service in the United States as a battlefield guide at the Gettysburg battlefield. And in terms of gaming on that side of things, perhaps a bit of a similar trek than some of my peers, but also rather unique. I started getting into historical miniature gaming just completely on my own. I was 11 or 12 at the time, and was on the computer one day and had just started getting into the Richard Sharp series by Bernard Cornwell. I had just started to really get into J.R.R. Tolkien, and I stumbled upon this game from a company in Britain called Alternative Armies called Flintlock.
Oh yeah,
and it was fantastical fantasy Napoleonic world where French elves were fighting English orcs and Prussian dwarves, and it was a mix of everything that I thought was cool at the time. And so I wasn't involved with any clubs. I didn't know anyone else that was gaming. I bought some starter sets and found out that the local distributor in the States for those games was going to be at these conventions run by an organization called HMGS, the Historical Miniature Game Society. And so November of 2001, I dragged my father, a military history enthusiast, but certainly not a gamer, dragged him to an HMGS show, and the rest is history. I spent far too much of the little money I had in high school buying random figures and rule books. I never really got into anything seriously beyond a couple games of Flintlock. And then I was at university at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, another great historical history town. I fell into line with a small group there that had started gaming and started playing Force on Force and Saga and some of the other hot games in circa 2010, 2011 with them. And really have just kind of gone through there. And actually it was Ron Carnegie from that group who introduced me to this World War II rule set called Chain of Command. And introduced me to this delightful world of lard and camaraderie. Went to graduate school out in California, gamed a little bit with some friends there, but really settled back into things gaming wise when I moved back to the East Coast about 4 years ago. And through the HMGS shows then was really introduced to the Lard America community that was really coalescing at the time.
Yeah.
And the rest has been history from there.
Right, brilliant. So how old are you now?
Oh, sorry, I'm currently 30.
You're currently 30. Well, definitely a lot younger than me then. So I think you qualify as young in this situation. So let's cut straight to the nub of the matter. What prompted this discussion was a piece on Little Wars TV, which I have to say is a very impressive and very professional setup. Those guys, well, what is it they bill themselves as? The best war games club in the history of the entire world ever, type of thing. But something like that, which is a great claim. But I tell you what, they have got the best war games club room in the history of the world whatsoever. Having seen it with my own eyes, I think it is the envy of the wargaming world. Yeah, it really does look a fabulous setup, and of course some of the stuff they produce. And I know you've been involved in some of the Gettysburg stuff that they've done there, which has been really great to see. And I love the way they did that, bringing in some of the different people, asking them about their command decisions at different points in the game, which was really a great way to make good television out of something that, watching somebody else do something, which is always a difficult thing to do. So anyway, what prompted this is they said, is historical wargaming dying out? And can I ask you, from your personal perspective, as somebody who lives on a historical battlefield, do you think that's the case?
Frankly, it certainly is a loaded question, and certainly the numbers show that there has been a slight decline. I mean, I know that they were citing the Great Wargaming Survey. Did I say it right, Jasper? Is it the Great Wargaming Survey or War Game Survey? I know he was giving Guy.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
In any case, the GWS certainly has the GWS has certainly noticed a dip in the younger generations of gamers, but nothing. I don't think anything particularly frightening. I have the chart in front of me that they did the data analysis not long ago, and even in the last few years, I think they only the number of gamers actually the number of gamers under 40, between 31 and 40, has gone from 30% of those surveyed to 26. The number under 30 has gone from 20 to 15. So that there is a dip. But I think there's also been a lot of extenuating circumstances, and I think that's the big issue from what I've seen with friends who I've tried to introduce to the hobby. There certainly are younger gamers. They absolutely are out there. They may not be in the numbers that enthusiasts, Gunnar Lopez, and we were saying just last night that when you don't have the time and the money and the space to really get involved, I think that's been the problem. I don't think it's a lack of interest. I know I hear a lot of naysayers both in the wargaming world and at the battlefield at historic sites. So people don't care about history anymore. No one's doing anything with history, and I don't buy that at all. I don't think You have to do much more than looking at popular films that come out and popular television that come out. I mean, Outlander and The Crown are hugely popular TV series here. More than half of the films that have won Best Picture at the Academy Awards in the last decade are films based off of historical events. There certainly is an interest in history, and it still remains strong. But for wargaming, I think it's the fact that right now, at least for Americans of my generation, and certainly I know the situation is different in the United Kingdom, but certainly for American millennial gamers, for American Gen Z gamers, yeah, I mean, when you're facing the student debt crisis, when the average American university student is coming out of college years with $35,000 in debt, when millennials are working, when half of millennials are working 2 jobs, when people are delaying buying houses and starting families, that it's not that there isn't an interest. It's not that they don't want to. It's more that there's just so much stacked against them. When leisure time and spending cash are at a premium, it certainly can slow things down a bit. And so I think that's one thing that never gets, we always, when this conversation comes up, and it always does, it's been going on even before I was in gaming, and I remember hearing about it from the first convention I went to. But I think we always try to talk about the hobby within a bubble. And this is not to say that other generations haven't had their difficulties, but I was in university during the big housing crisis, during the Great Recession of 2008, 2010. We really never recovered from that. And then surely we're going to see economic impacts of the COVID crisis for a while. And so I think we try too often to be both the identifier of the problem and the fixer of this question of why aren't there more young folks in gaming. But I think there certainly are some things that are just out of our hands. And again, I don't think it's a lack of interest. I've run games, historical miniatures games, as just kind of casual fun for a lot of coworkers of mine over the years, for friends of mine, for coworkers of my wife's, other history employees, other museum folks. I've run games for Lutheran ministers and other graduate students, and I've never encountered any kind of disposition against it. I've never encountered anyone who says, "Oh, this is awful. I don't want to be involved with this." But the biggest thing that I have seen is that while many of my friends enjoy it, I have a couple buddies who come over to the house here once a month, once every few weeks to play games. The biggest thing is actually making that jump and investing in it, just because for a lot of folks, they just don't have the means to do it.
Now, one of the things I'm wondering about is, we obviously live in a world where it's possible to play games without leaving home. So you can link up and play games, just about any game you want online. What appeal does historical wargaming have, do you think, to somebody of your generation, that sort of 30 mark, that could coax them away from the computer? Because, we hear a lot about it's, they're keyboard warriors and they're playing on their computers and doing that. But what's our USP? What's the unique selling point that we've got that makes historical wargaming more attractive than sitting in your bedroom with the curtains closed and gaming with somebody who lives in Tokyo or Ho Chi Minh City or wherever? I don't know.
Well, I think, frankly, I hadn't thought about it much really until this past year, until everybody was kind of stuck in their homes because of the COVID crisis. And I think the creative and artistic side of the hobby, particularly when you think about, at least in American pop culture, how wildly popular just crafting in general has become, that there are whole now competition television shows about who is the best maker and who can create these best crafts. And in terms of creating scenery and painting figures, I think for a lot of folks, particularly for not just my generation, but even folks who are older, I think for a lot of people who may not have the most fulfilling jobs, who may be in an employment situation where they're not working in the field that they wanted to, they've not worked in the field they studied, that there is something to be said about being able to come home if you do have limited kind of leisure time and being productive with that, sitting down and painting a squad of Africa Corps figures like I've got on my desk right now. That there's been plenty of my generation. I even did it last night, where you can just zone out and play a computer game for an hour or two and call it a night, and that's it. But when I've done that, certainly in recent weeks and months, I don't quite have that sense of fulfillment as when I do when I've built this building for my next skirmish game. I've painted this squad. I've flocked these bases, and And I think that really does have an appeal, certainly with COVID starting to feel somewhat like Groundhog Day, where every day just kind of feels the same thing again and again. A few weeks ago, I personally was really just struggling for some kind of sense of achievement and accomplishment when everything was just kind of going from A to Z, back and forth every day. And I think having the hobby, having something where I could sit down and say, all right, for the next hour, I'm going to make this new army list, or I'm going to put these trees together, or I'm going to glue this building, or base these figures. I think having that sense of creativity, having that sense of real accomplishment in something that you are passionate about, I think is a big draw, and certainly something that computer gaming doesn't offer.
I think that's an interesting point. And one of the things I find about the hobby is if you're fed up with building terrain, go and paint some figures. If you're fed up with painting some figures, go and read a book about your next battle you want to do. And it's because it's multifaceted that you never really get fed up with it. Whereas fishing, you're fishing, and the next day you're fishing, and the next day you're fishing. So that's the positive thing about the hobby, is that sense of fulfillment. And I think we can all relate to that. I mean, it's interesting, actually, during COVID, you haven't seen so much about people posting pictures of the games they're playing, but they're posting pictures of what they've been painting and what they've been making. And I think we all enjoy that community spirit of, just going onto Twitter and Facebook or wherever, and actually sharing those experiences with people. So that's the positive stuff. But what, in your experience, has not been positive? Our good friend Jay Arnold from the Veteran Wargamer podcast talked in that Little Wars TV video piece about potential barriers to entry. Do you see barriers in place that could be putting people off taking the plunge, apart from that lack of finance that you've touched?
Yeah, and I think cost really is a big thing, but I think there's the biggest barriers is just finding the gateway. And again, I think this is where there's where we really see a stark contrast in what I've gleaned as being the wargame culture in the United States compared to the wargame culture in the United Kingdom. That we certainly have our fair share of games clubs, but the majority of the people that I know who play war games aren't a member of a formal club that has elected officers and meets in the town or borough hall or things like that. And even you and I were chatting beforehand about just the shows and things like that and the big conventions. And we certainly have our fair share of them in the States, but they're also very spread out geographically. Yeah. There are some folks who may only attend 1, 2, maybe 3 shows a year. Yeah. And if they don't have a close group of friends to game with, that's really their only chance to game. And so I think a lot of it is that for a lot of folks who may have an interest in historicals, even for people who may play historical war games, computer games, or board games, or for sci-fi and fantasy gamers, it's not something that is as readily apparent. I stumbled across historical gaming through fooling around on the internet 20 years ago, and I'm sure that's how a lot of people these days do, but that's not a guaranteed way to get folks. Now, I do think that's starting to change. I do have a lot of friends who've been going to some of the bigger sci-fi and fantasy conventions, gaming conventions in the States, Adepticon in Chicago. I have a number of friends who sell and produce historical games, Firelock games, and the Blood and Plunder, Oak and Iron, Blood and Valor folks, my friend David Enstenis and the Wargaming Company with their Excellence Resultat Napoleonic game. I know some people have been trying to curb the bigger markets. And frankly, I mean, it's starting to come into more popular culture. I'm seeing more miniatures games and things at the comic book shops, or even on television last season on the American cartoon comedy show South Park. There was an episode where they were playing a 17th century pirate game, miniatures game in the popular episode. So it's certainly not as prevalent as Warhammer. But I think that the biggest thing is just getting people in. The idea of the school club, which I hear a lot of people talking about for a variety of reasons, I don't think is really a viable option in a lot of places anymore. Schools aren't always too keen about having random adults who aren't teachers coming in to run things. I think the idea of the school club, the idea of the local club doesn't really exist. And there are conventions when we're not in the world of COVID, but again, you know, I'm often envious when I hear you guys in the Oddcast talk about driving here, there, and everywhere for all these shows. And we have the historical shows in the States, but they're not really spread out. They're, like I said, most people I think are maybe going to 2-3 shows a year. You show up to an American convention. We were talking about, you know, it's always bigger is better. You know, you're one of 16 players, a dozen players in this massive game. And I think that's I think that'll lead us to another conversation too. The age of the 10,000 Napoleonic 28 millimeter figures on a table, it can be very daunting, because I think for a lot of young gamers, you see some of those big, grandiose convention games, and you say, "Oh, this hobby isn't for me. I could never do something like that."
No.
But I think it's difficult. I remember my first years going to wargaming shows here. Again, I was going as a teenager. I had my father along. We didn't know anyone at these conventions. And there were some times, particularly as a teenager, where I was welcomed with open arms into the games. And then there were some times where myself or my friends who I bring along to some of the shows with were not welcome. That, you know, we sometimes very aggressively, you know, talked down to, sometimes just frankly ignored.
I've seen at conventions people sit down and spend 40 minutes talking about how the rules work and running through that. And I just think, if I was a youngster, I'd think this is like doing my homework.
Yeah.
You just start the game and then tell me what choices I've got when it's my go.
And I think that's earlier I mentioned kind of unintentional gatekeeping. I think you have very much the intentional gatekeepers, who are the folks who, you know, oh, you haven't read Hans von Luck's memoir, then you can't play this World War II game. But like you said, I think there's the people that, it's the game masters who run the games. I played a game that one of the Historicons that was down in Virginia. It was supposed to be somewhere outside of Addis Ababa, East African campaign, 1941. Yeah. I had an Italian light machine gun team. There were 36 people playing that game. I had an Italian light machine gun team. Once we spent 25 minutes going over the rules, I was the first team to be activated. I rolled dice to fire my Breda, and at that point, didn't cause any damage. And the game master said, it's probably going to be about an hour and a half or so till you do anything else. So, well, I'll come get you when I need you. And it's just that, you know, why run a game if you're not going to get people involved?
It's unacceptable, really, isn't it? It's literally unacceptable. You are not just not promoting the hobby, you're destroying the hobby.
And I think the other thing that the really ugly gatekeeping, though, and I know that you have spoken out against it on the Oddcast and on social media, and I bring it up because I witnessed it even just last week. The rampant misogyny and sexism and racism in the hobby is certainly good. And even if we're not even talking about bringing non-male identifying players in, but even just I think for a younger generation, even if they do identify as male, you know, sexist comments are just not something that are tolerated. I also think, though, there is something to be said kind of about the Lard Day model, which we've done a number of them here in the Mid-Atlantic, and I know throughout the Lard American community they've been popping up all over the place. And I think those kind of casual, smaller, low-stakes settings where you have 2 or 3 games running, you have 10, 15, maybe 20 very personable people playing. I think that's a good way to get people involved. It's realizing that I think that the old ways that people got into the hobby, there's nothing wrong with them, but that the world has changed so much that a lot of those options aren't really viable.
They're not going to be replicated, are they? Nobody's going to come into the hobby the way I came into the hobby, because they're going to be. It's not Airfix, it's GW. They're going to be doing that, and they're not going to be looking at historicals.
I think one of the reasons why maybe you have seen a larger spike on historical war game computer games or historical war game board game games is that those hurdles to get into the hobby are much shorter, and they're far fewer of them. It doesn't take much in the States to go to a board game shop, to go to even a craft store, or just, you know, even a place like Target to buy a board game like Memoir 44. I think the argument that, oh, well, the younger people don't get into historicals because people just don't care about history. It's not, you know, if we don't teach the history, then they don't care about it. And I've been in the museum and historical site profession for over a decade. I've got graduate degrees in history. I've taught history. I've worked at museums and battlefields, and I don't buy that argument at all. Certainly, and it's a whole other conversation. Certainly, the manner and how history is taught, what is taught, how it's taught, how much is taught has changed.
Okay, so I'm going to promote you now. I know you don't do royalty over there, but just to embarrass you, I'm going to make you king of American wargaming for the day. So you
my wife just snorted in derision over in the next room.
I just love the idea of the new monarch. They're gonna cut your head off probably. But so you've got a choice. What are you going to implement? You've now got 5 minutes to give me a 3-point program. What can the hobby do to make itself more appealing and stop it dying out if we accept the premise that it might possibly and just could? What's going to bring more young people in their whatever ages to the hobby?
Well, and I will preface this as being just anointed king, my opinion differs significantly from many others. I am not speaking for all Americans. I'm not speaking for all American gamers.
You don't have to. That's not
how
monarchy works.
I think the biggest thing we need to do is really just kind of tear down the barriers around our little sub-community that we've put up. I think for a lot of people, certainly it was certainly the case when I got into the hobby 20 years ago. I think for a lot of people, there's the historical gaming community. There's the historical miniatures gaming community, and there's the sci-fi miniatures gaming community, and there's the fantasy miniatures gaming community. There's the historical board game community. There's the historical computer game community. We're all trying to do the same thing. It's all tabletop gaming. We're all, at the end of the day, we're all engaging in the same type of activity for the same reasons. And there's nothing that says that we can't be a part of all of those different camps. They can be camps for different regiments in the same army. We can all be together. And I think I've seen at some shows here in the States a lot of resistance to offering board games as an option, a lot of resistance to offering sci-fi and fantasy games. And I think if we kind of show a more inclusive community, I not having done much sci-fi and fantasy gaming, I really can't speak too much to them, but I certainly know from what I've seen online, from numbers I've seen, those shows, the larger gaming conventions for the board games in the United States, for sci-fi miniature gaming, they're booming healthy industries. And I don't think, and that's not to say that the historical miniature gaming community isn't booming and healthy, but I think if we show a more united front with this, what is increasingly a very popular tabletop gaming culture in this country, the massive rise in popularity of board games in this country in the last 10, 15, 20 years has been extraordinary. We are so far past the age of Avalon Hill and SPI. And sure, if people want to play their very crunchy World War II hex-based games, that's fine. But if people want to play the Memoir 44s of the world, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And there are ways then to say, well, hey, if you like this game, you know, if you like What a Tanker, it's a very simple tank game. But if you want something with a little more crunch, if you want something with a little more realism, if you want something that has more, that offers more command decisions, well, then maybe you could try this. I think if we realize that there's a lot of gateways into the hobby, and I think for a long time it's been, well, no, this is our little camp here. This is how we've done things. This is, if you've not come into this hobby through A, B, C, or D, that's a problem. And I think the only way that we're really going to, besides all the pitfalls and all the hurdles involved, and we talked about that at length in this interview, I think realizing that there's plenty of areas where we can cast our nets, if you will. And I know from friends of mine who are vendors and retailers who've gone to those larger shows. I mentioned Adepticon in Chicago before. Used to not have any historical games, but now there's more and more. I know the Midwest Lard guys, the Lard folk out in Chicago, we're hoping to run a number of TooFatLardies games at Adepticon. I know Michael Vesnick has talked about wanting to run a sharp practice day at Adepticon similar to what's been done in the UK. Yeah. And I think realizing that we don't just have to have our little historical miniature gaming show. It could just be historical tabletop gaming, or frankly, it could just be tabletop gaming, because all it needs to happen is somebody at a show who's used to playing 40K, who's used to playing Magic the Gathering, who's used to playing board games. All it needs to happen is for them to walk by a table where there's a Napoleonic game or a World War II game going on, and say, "Oh, wait a second, that looks really cool." But I think it's on us to be the university and the school gaming clubs that there were 20, 30 years ago, to be the folks who got together with their Airfix kits. We need to meet the potential gamers and the interested people halfway, because I think the folks like me who stumbled across the hobby one day on the internet and kind of blazed my own trail by myself for my first 10 years in the hobby, there's always going to be them, but that's not going to be enough in any age group to keep this thing growing. But surely there's potential out there. Surely there's interest.
And we're back. And both of those interviews, I think, were really interesting. They were differing viewpoints from people within the hobby, people who we know, but also counterpoints to some of the other discussions that are available online and were featured in the Little Wars TV piece. So what I want to do now is to have our big issue to chat about some of the points that Andy and Andrew have raised. And I think some of the areas that would be really interesting to cover are visibility, about how wargaming gets the right exposure, how we present the visibility of the hobby. And one of the points that Andrew picked up was about gatekeeping. Yeah, I think that's an interesting aspect about visibility, as to whether we want the hobby to make active steps to limit the amount of gatekeeping which might go on, certainly as regards presentation games at shows, whether they're participations or demonstrations. Then I thought we would be able to talk a little bit about first contact, how we meet people who are new to the hobby. Because I think one of the aspects relating to the discussion of whether historical wargaming hobby is dying is a question which relates to, well, are new people coming into the hobby? So the first contact with a person who may not have been a historical wargamer before is going to be important. So there's a question there about how we make that first contact enjoyable and welcoming. And then I think probably one thing which overlays all of this is presenting the right image in the historical wargaming hobby. What image do we project? What image do we want to project? Can we do anything to change that? Is that something which is a community-based thing, or is it an individual-based thing?
We need to change it. That's a big question. And do we want to change it? Yeah.
So, and armed with those questions, we're going to talk through that and come to perhaps our answers as to whether we think the historical wargaming hobby is dying, which is the question that the Little Wars TV guys asked the hobby to answer. So, Nick, to start off with you, I'm going to go and get your thoughts about some of those points.
A whole load of stuff there, isn't there, really? I thought the interviews, as you said, really interesting. And all those points you just raised, Sydney, is like a, I just feel that you've landed me with a massive tower question with about 18 facets to it that I'm going to try and answer in a paragraph. But I think, I've observed a few things from what Andy and Andrew were saying. Firstly, that 30 is apparently young, and I didn't think 30 was that young, but I think there are younger people than 30, 33 in the hobby, but we've got to reach out to where we can, right? We're all, those of us on this show are certainly old enough to be their parents, so there's a real sort of generation gap there. And I really noticed a few things that they said, which made me think back to other conversations I've had also with other guys sort of online, some of the Discord guys that are gaming, who some of those from a younger generation as well. It's a few things. Now, firstly, for guys of our age, it was, you listen to what got us into the hobby, and everybody says, well, it was Airfix, and it was the war films of the 1970s, etc. These days, I'm hearing a consistent picture that most people kind of enter into the hobby through Games Workshop and playing Games Workshop products, playing with Games Workshop products at school. And crucially, a lot of people, we heard sort of, I think Andy say about it there, I know that other people say this, the crucial role actually that influential school teachers can have in bringing people into the hobby really counts as well. And it gets people in at an early age and at a young age and engages them and makes the hobby more accessible, makes it more fun. It's a huge role that there's played there in facilitating new blood, young blood into the hobby, and accepting therefore that actually they're not going to, you don't come in through that gateway playing historical games. You come into that gateway playing all kinds of other stuff with all kinds of other toys, and that maybe historical gaming is one of the destinations that you may end up with, 30 years down the line. And also this idea as well that, we have social media, the guys on Little Wars themselves are producing great content. Social media, YouTube is a really interesting place, and how young people look to YouTube to find their pleasure, to find their relaxation. And this kind of people who watch this also watch something else. This almost artificial intelligence that these networks use now to put content in front of our eyes is really important. And so if we want to be reaching those people, we've got to be hanging out where they are. And young people are producing great content. Let me just say one other thing as well before we broaden it out a little bit. Think about who produces content in the hobby. Now go back sort of in the 70s and in the 80s. Who's producing wargaming content in the 1970s, in the 1980s, in the 1990s? It's old blokes. It's mainly old blokes. Look at Donald Featherstone, Charles Grant, Paddy Griffiths, Phil Barker, generally labour under the label of old bloke, okay? And we could put ourselves under the label of old bloke. But the thing is now, if you're looking online, and this is where I think we challenge the idea whether or not the hobby is greying. If you look online, you look who's producing great content and great material online, it's young people. It's people who are 30. It's the guys on Little Wars TV that are showing to me that actually young people are bringing huge amounts into this hobby already. We're just not always able to see it. Rich, what do you want to say?
Beasts of War. Look at Beasts of War.
Exactly.
I would call all of them young by comparison with us. But what's interesting with Beasts of War on tabletop, call them what you will, is that the stuff they present is an eclectic mix. It isn't historical wargaming, it's gaming. And I feel very strongly that what both of the Andy and Andrew said was the fact that, you can't pitch yourself purely at people who you think are going to be historical gamers, because that might well be a bloke you've known for years who is interested in military history, and maybe he's a veteran and he reads avidly on it. And the hobby's always going to pick up people like that, because you might say to him, listen, mate, do you fancy a war game? I'm doing this and whatever, and they might come along. But if we're going to get a younger audience, and I do think 30 is young, and I'll come on to that in a minute, we need to be prepared to say, actually, these people are if you're running let's put it like this, if you're a company and you're going to run a marketing campaign to sell caravans, you're going to put it in Caravan Weekly magazine. You're not going to put it in a general publication, because you know that everybody who buys Caravan Weekly is potentially going to be a customer of yours. Well, I would say that if people are already gamers, then they're already halfway to thinking potentially about being a historical wargamer. Now, they might not even think that what they're doing is historical wargaming. They could quite happily play a game of What a Tanker and think this is a good, fun game. And then, like everything, gradually as you get into these things, you find your interest, is gaining, and you're looking at more, potentially getting more involved in the historical side of gaming. I know I was talking to Mike Whitaker about this the other day, and I think he was saying something at the end of the Herrywood show that confirmed that. Sid, sorry.
I think one of the things that we've all been talking about is having those barriers between historical wargaming and other activities not being impermissible. We want to have things which allow us the flexibility to attract people in who may not predominantly have that much of a historical interest. They may have a curiosity, they may not be avid sort of readers of thick history books or uniform info. We want something which is fluid, we want something which is permeable. And I think that's similar to what we do in a lot of our games. I've for a long time been as interested in alt history, historical plausibility of why things didn't turn out how they could have done, or more accurately, why things did turn out how they did and why certain things didn't happen. I think that's just as interesting as looking at why things did happen. It's kind of frowned upon by historians. Historians don't like alternative history. It's not proper history in a lot of ways, I think, and there is a historical discussion about how far you can stretch that. But that, to somebody who's a role player, who uses their imagination just as much as they use paintbrushes or figures, that's a big part of their hobby. Also, with things crossing over from board games, people are very comfortable if they're in a board game cafe playing a board game with 20 pieces. Now, that's not hugely dissimilar than it might be a 20-figure war game, but they probably don't think of it in that way. But there's a lot of synergies there. There's a lot of crossover points between these different gaming activities.
There totally is, and maybe one of the reasons that they don't see it that way is they're not exposed to it. And this comes back to the very first point that I felt both of the guys made, which was about visibility. If we are not visible, they can't see us. So we need to make sure we're visible. And then that comes on to the third point that you made, Sid, which is if we are visible, what do people see? Now, it's very easy, and you hear it trotted out a lot, male, stale and pale, talking about historical wargamers. Well, frankly, I find that as offensive as, using other terminology about other groups, because I don't think you can generalise. And because somebody is white and male, which I am, doesn't, I think, necessarily mean they're stale, because I feel I've got a good few sets of rules in me yet. And I think some of the ideas that Nick and I have come out with over the years have not been stale ideas. We have been prepared to push the boundaries. So let's not put people in too many boxes, but equally we have to accept the fact that therefore, when people come along to play a game, we shouldn't, and if we're running a game at a show, we shouldn't be only looking at people who look like us. We should be talking to the people that don't look like us and that don't have historian wargamer written all over them. We should be talking to people who are interested, because ultimately they're the people that are going to bring different ideas to the hobby, and that's got to be positive.
Yeah, I agree. This is a journey that starts with tolerance. I think this is, you have to tolerate what other people are gaming, and that they're gaming things that are different to you. So we might love the idea of more and more people playing historical games. We might look at people playing zombie games and think, what are they doing that for? Where's the interest in that? But actually, if you want to broaden historical games, counterintuitively, you actually want to be encouraging people to play other games, to be playing those games that you wouldn't normally play, because it's the crossover that matters. And if historical gaming is the niche, then actually more and more people playing Games Workshop or other fantasy role-play games or whatever is something we should absolutely be encouraging and lapping up, because we know that the bigger the pool of gamers becomes, the bigger the pool of war gamers becomes, the bigger the pool of historical gamers becomes, and the more. And we've never had it so good. This is what I heard Henry saying this the other day, Henry Hyde, and I agree with him absolutely. There's never been a richer time, a better time to be a war gamer than there is now. It's ideally placed to grow. Not just historical gaming, but all gaming. And this kind of starts with this tolerance, this moment where somebody walks up to your table, or you clap eyes on somebody across a crowded war games room, and there's the moment where you could reach out to them and include them in your game. You can either choose to include people by just saying hello, or you can choose to close them out. And if you close them out, why would they ever come back to you? And why would they ever want to play in your historical war game?
And I think that tolerance aspect works both ways. So we often have discussed this in the context of the games we would put on and the type of image or visibility we'd present to the hobby. But I'm sure there's more than one person who's listening to this podcast, and I'd probably include myself in this, who've walked around a war game show, and we've been the observer, and we've walked around and we've seen people playing games with unpainted figures and board games cracked out of the pack. And we've probably thought, it looks kind of interesting, but those figures aren't painted and they've just got that board game out of the pack. And yeah, it's a war game show, isn't it, really? Is that, well, maybe I'll move on to this Napoleonics thing and take a few photos. And actually, tolerance works both ways. I think for people to be able to join us in having a rich discussion, we've also got to reach outside our own little boxes. And one of the things that is true, and it's not necessarily an age thing, that when we have found a hobby that we like and we found our box, we kind of feel comfortable there and we kind of like that. And we sometimes might feel that everyone's got to conform to our view of the world. There's a sort of a pull and a push there, I think.
And I think the truth is, it's hard, okay? So, you know, we've been doing demonstration games and going to war game shows for many, many years. And I like to think we're quite good at it. I like to think we put on good, interactive games that we have lots of people around our table. We have lots of fun. We make games attractive. We I think, draw in a mix of ages and gender as well around our table, and that's really important. But you know what? It's difficult to do that. It's hard. And I know that at the end of a long day of doing that, sometimes I know that I can be at the table and I can be standing there and perhaps we just finished the game and I know that somebody will come up to my table and I know full well that actually it's, you know, we should be engaging. But you know what? I'm really tired because I've been doing this all day. And sometimes I think, you know, I just don't have the energy to completely be, you know, to draw this additional person to be open with them. But surely we should do. And the truth is that these things take effort. If you want to expand, if you want to make things inclusive and open, it does take effort. And it can be tiring to do that, but the benefits are there for all to see, aren't they? You know, that one person that you choose to engage with, you know, what door could you be opening with them? We all try doubly hard, I know, when youngsters come up to our table, we all try doubly hard to engage with them because we know actually the massive influence and how inspirational what they're looking at can be for them.
Yeah, very much so. I totally agree. The other thing is as well, if you look at shows like Salute, I can remember regularly people coming up to me and saying, a lot of sci-fi and fantasy games here. This isn't historical wargaming. But I tell you what, that's a view that is really peculiar to people of my generation, I think, because when I talk to good friends of ours who come to the Lardy Games days, you look at people like Hobbsy, Mike Hobbs from Meeples and Miniatures, you look, you know, a lot of our friends, I'm not going to name names, or I'll name Hobbsy's because I just like to name drop him so people know that I know celebrities and wizards.
And he's only in his 20s as well.
And that's right, and that's inches. But he's a guy who typifies the modern gamer. In fact, if you remember on Twitter, he used to have a Twitter handle, Mike the Wargamer, and he changed it to Mike the Gamer, and that was as a result of being exposed to a lot of the stuff that Neil was doing on Meeples and Miniatures. And again, Neil, classic case. These are guys who love to play a war game, but they also love to play sci-fi, fantasy, board games, blah, 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 across the board. Now, if we try and dig a big trench around historical wargaming and put up walls and say, only historical wargamers welcome here, we've been missing out on blokes who we know are tip-top blokes and girls who we know in the hobby who've come into it because they've come from a different type of gaming background, but who now make huge contributions to our part of the hobby as well as the rest of the gaming community as a whole. I'm sorry, I'm passionate about this. You can tell I'm getting worked up here.
As a journey for the hobby, it's a journey to broaden the hobby, to make the hobby more diverse, but not in a politically correct way, because it's diversity which is born out of the openness of a hobby. But it's also a similar journey which role-playing has gone through. You sort of think about Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, I'm sure all of us played that at school, or some sort of RuneQuest or Call of Cthulhu. And those hobbies were very much of a demographic type, let's say, predominantly in the 80s and the 90s, and that's changed immeasurably now. You know, you go to a convention like Dragon Meet in London, which is held every December, which is a role-play convention. Or the UK Games Expo. I know you went there yourself, Nick, with your daughter. Yep. The people at those events are very diverse as regards gender. They're very diverse as regards age. And one of the things that the role-playing community has embraced, or the industry, if you like, is the fact that there's a massive audience out there, which is female gamers who want to participate. And there's no reason why the UK Historical Wargaming hobby can't learn lessons from, and the worldwide Historical Wargames hobby can't if not learn lessons, then certainly look at that and say that there's a potential there. Whether or not people want to realise that, there is a potential opportunity there.
Yeah, anything by any account, as soon as you make something exclusive, right, you are by definition locking people out. So if we deal with exclusively historical wargamers, or we deal with exclusively, certain game type or rule sets, then you're locking people out all the time. If you lock people out, why would they bother coming and knocking on your door again? We need to be making the hobby attractive to everybody. And if they're young people, that's fantastic. But also, let's attract a load of grey-haired people into the hobby as well, because we just want more people playing. I don't really care how old they are. I think it's fantastic when we get a mix. I think it's fantastic that we got, certainly, when I see what we get around some of the game days that we go to, the collection of people around the table, brilliant. Really, all mix of backgrounds and even gender and age mix is fantastic too. There's always more that we can do, and we're doing it. We're trying hard to do it as best as we can to encourage more and more people in. We're playing loads of really good quality games, and we're playing loads of really good quality historical games. And I would happily play any other game if I thought it was going to be good fun, because at the end of the day, what I want is a good, fun game.
And you've done a lot of that over lockdown, didn't you? With the family. You had a big family games table where the dog came top or something, wasn't it?
Yeah, we played all kinds of games. And you know what? In the back of my head somewhere, I was this idea that actually we'll get these guys to play a load of games, and then I'm going to slip in a game of What a Tanker, and they can play that. And then, we can see because my daughter is a closet gamer, okay? I know that in her, she loves to play these games. Yeah. And I see her very much as somebody who's on the periphery, somebody who goes to Games Expo or who goes to even goes to War Games Convention, and who will stand and look at a game but won't have the confidence to get involved. And I think actually we can draw these people in. There are millions of people like my daughter out there who are people in their early 20s that are potentially gamers for the next 50 years. Right?
Yeah, so they're unlikely at her age to start off playing big battle Napoleonics, to go with a cliche.
Correct. Absolutely right.
And far more likely to be playing a board game, and then another board game, and then maybe a bit of a fantasy game with a few figures, and then maybe one day What a Tanker. And then they're on the path, and they're making a contribution to a hobby as a whole. Not just in terms of playing games, but also of contributing financially to the businesses in the hobby, because the hobby will die if there's no businesses in it. So maybe somebody only spends 25% of their game spend on historical wargaming, but it's still putting money into the pot that is part of the industry, and that oils the wheels of gaming. But, so what I'm picking out from this, and if I'm honest, when I listen to those two guys talking, if that was a school report for the hobby, on the state of the hobby, I am not hearing A or A star. I'm hearing B-, maybe C, could do better. That the hobby needs to be certain that it's making itself more visible. It needs to be certain that when people come up and make that first point of contact, they know that they're not just going to be welcomed, but they're not going to be talked down to, and they are going to have a fun time. Because if you have a fun time, you want to go back. If you don't have a fun time, you don't want to go back. And the other thing that I keep coming back to, and you mentioned this, Sid, is what is the image we're presenting? Now, it's all very well for me to say it's a stereotype to present blokes like me as being misogynistic and, unfriendly. It might be a stereotype, but there is a danger within the hobby that we can send the wrong messages out. And both those guys picked up points when I was talking to them about how we need to be aware about the feelings of other people who are coming into the hobby who are not people like us. And we've got a responsibility to ensure that, when we're on social media, well, in fact, at any time, but particularly when we are in the public eye, like maybe even doing this, although we try and be frank and honest when we have our discussions without, worrying about treading on eggshells. But when you're out there presenting the hobby, when you're on social media, when you're in an online forum, we have to think about what people would make of wargaming as a hobby if that was the first shop window that they came across with that content on. And I am not seeing that there is, you know, universal goodness out there. And I do think we need to sometimes sit back and look at the way the hobby behaves online and think about whether that's presenting the right image. I don't want to go too far down that route because I'm not pointing fingers at anybody in particular, but I think generally we have to be sensitive to the feelings of others.
I think there's a lot of good stuff in there, and I wouldn't really disagree with much of that. But I think that's just one end of the telescope or one end of the tunnel, and I think that the end that you're looking at is a very good answer to the question: are we happy with the state of the historical wargaming hobby? Slightly different question to the one the Little Wars TV guys were asking about whether it's dying or not. But just taking those points, I think that that's a great summary for what a community can do. The difficulty with a hobby, and I suppose any community, is it's not really that homogenous. It's got people doing lots of different things, some of them who do it a lot and some of them who just touch on historical wargaming. So saying that we should or we need to do something with a community sort of approach, I think that is possible. It's possibly plausible to change it over time and evolve it. But there's another end to that telescope or that tunnel, which I think is much more immediate. And that's perhaps more along the side of what we personally, each individually do relating to the hobby. And yes, you know, I'm a man. Yes, I'm white. Yes, I'm in my very early 50s. You wouldn't know it if you met me, but I am. But I find that completely irrelevant when I'm describing the things I really enjoy. And when I talk about the things I really enjoy about historical wargaming hobby, I always try and do so in a way that doesn't make people think that I'm slightly insane, but hopefully I do it in an open, honest, interesting way, because I find the subjects which interest me, honestly, very interesting. And I think that it starts with a personal journey. It is about tolerance, but it's also about personal openness, personal integrity. And I think that there's something we can all take away from that. We don't need to change the historical wargaming hobby overnight. We don't need to get the hobby necessarily to move in a particular direction because we think that's the right thing to do. It does, I think, come down to a personal journey, as so much does in life, about how we interact with people about things that we find interesting and passionate. And the journey doesn't have to be some huge, this is what we need to do to change. The journey is possibly within us as much to actually say, well, I'll just do whatever I can and make people who come to whatever game I'm doing as welcome as possible and explain why I find what I'm doing interesting.
I think that's precisely my point. What I'm not suggesting is some kind of Jehovah's wargaming thing where we go out and bang the drum and push leaflets through people's doors. What I'm actually saying is we need to be sure when people come to us that we are welcoming and inclusive and encouraging of them, rather than, you know, there's a limit. And the answer is actually to go to the very start of the question, do I think the hobby is dying? No, I don't think the hobby is dying. I think that's highly unlikely. I think in some respects we've never had it so good, but I do think we could be doing a lot better. As I say, it's B-, not A+, A star.
My mind goes to a slightly different level on this. You know, think back to your own origins, your own first exposure to the hobby. You know, whether you're you know, Richard or Sid, or whether you're somebody who's out there in the internet land listening to this oddcast. Think back to your first gaming experience, the moment that captured your imagination, right? That moment that captured your imagination had a wow moment to it. There was something about, wow, look at this. Probably look at this game. It was probably an eye candy moment where you thought, my God, I've never seen anything like this before. We've got to put those moments in front of people for historical wargaming so they can see and feel and have their own wow moment for historical wargaming. Or I'd say actually for gaming in general. If they have it for gaming, as I said earlier on, if they have it for gaming, then there's a chance that they can become historical gamers. I sound like it sounds like it's you can aspire towards it, but whether you aspire towards it or end up in the dustbin of historical war games, I'm not quite sure which. It depends which way you want to see it, I guess. But without that wow moment, nothing matters. We can get 1,500 people through the door of a war game show, or 15,000 people. If they all walk around seeing a load of boring stuff, they're all going to walk out the other end, and we won't bring anybody else into the hobby. If, however, they are excited and energized by what they see and the games that they can take part in, then we've got a chance in bringing somebody in and growing the hobby. I think it's that simple.
I think I totally agree. The one thing I would say with that is that WoW translates for a lot of people as being big. It's the huge Napoleonic display with 14,000 figures. It's the massive sort of World War II engagement where you're doing Kursk at Salute or whatever it is. I think to do that WoW sort of thing, for a lot of people, it is visual, but it's also can be something which is also something which might have been lacking in the 70s, early 80s. It's a social interaction. It's a social attribute. A lot of us, I think, in the 80s, well, I certainly did, speaking completely honestly, when I went to wargame shows, the WoW for me was the spectacle. And I thought that was what a historical wargamer was all about. It was building regiments, it was building battalions, it was building armies, and as many armies as you could have, and staging those big games. And it took me probably about 15 years, 20 years maybe as a wargamer to really find what I enjoyed, which was actually wargamers, as opposed to just the war games themselves. It was the social element. And for me, that's just as much a part of the hobby as anything else.
It's fun, isn't it? It's fun. A war game should be fun. It doesn't have to be big or small or fat or round or tall or short. It just has to be fun.
But
your wow factor can be people as well. And yes, I think that's a big takeaway.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. Look at the number of times we've won prizes for games that we run at war game shows, not because they've been any good, not because the terrain's been good, but because we've been having a laugh with people.
Well, life is like this, right? You want to do again the things which were fun and gave you a buzz. Okay, life is like that. You have some things in life, that you think is great, and you want to go back and do it again. Some things you think, shit, I'm never doing that again, and that you never do it again. We want to make sure war game is in that first category. It's got to be in that first category. We've got to give people that buzz that sends them home. I remember going home from my first sort of proper sort of war game with a real buzz and a spring in my step about, wow, these things were going to keep me awake at night, and I was going to go home and make plans and note out, draw things up, and my head was spinning with things. This is what we want young people or people of any age to have when they come to the hobby.
And I think that's got as much of a chance of keeping people in the hobby as anything else as well. If you've got that experience and you have it with people, whether it's virtual, whether it's actual, whether it's a show or a club or people's homes, I think if you've got that experience, you're more likely to stay in the hobby. And that's something which, let's be honest, is as applicable to old people, young people, middle-aged people or whatever. It's also staying within the hobby. It's not leaving the hobby because you just find it impossible to get around, because you find it too difficult, or we've all been there, find it too difficult just to collect Roman, Assyrian, Carthaginian armies, or to paint to a standard that we see online, or to have the perfect terrain set up, or to really have rules that just work. Those are some of the challenges: collecting information, developing things, not getting bored, not giving up. Those are sort of challenges that the hobby does have. But I think the more time which is spent on things that we enjoy in the hobby and not feeling that we need to be somebody else's perfect, that's the thing which perhaps trends into what we talked about with Mojo, about other people's ways of keeping the hobby going. But in the question, is historical wargaming dying? It's not just a community thing. It's something that you're trying to make sure that we don't evolve the hobby into something which is a sort of perfect place where every miniature is painted perfectly or even painted at all.
Yeah, and I personally, I do not believe that historical gaming is dying. I do not believe it. I don't believe it. I don't see it around me, and maybe I'm having a very small blinker view, but I don't think it is. I think, as I said earlier on, that we've got loads of more product manufacturers, more opportunities to game, more avenues, more mechanism, more more ways to connect. You know, even COVID, okay, something which locks people in their houses hasn't prevented people from wargaming. Wargaming, historical wargaming as well, has gone on throughout COVID. And if historical wargaming is something that older people do, well, the good news is there are more older people now than ever before. So I think historical gaming, you know, against that background, has got every possibility of a bright future. And of course, because we're all picking it up so close to death, there's always good figures to buy on eBay.
You're not allowed to say that.
Well, yeah, it's a part of the circle of wargaming life, isn't it? Is that old figures go on to new homes, and that's all part of the fun.
Yeah, that's very true. And of course, you are allowed to say anything like that. Yeah, no, I think you're right. And the big thing that is bigger than ever is the community of wargamers. And whilst we heard from somebody in the UK and the US, those barriers really don't apply anymore. We have a very vibrant international community where ideas and thoughts and friendship can flow through the internet. It's not simply reliant on just who you know in your hometown or home state or meet at the occasional convention.
Well, a great example of that is we mentioned earlier on, you know, the Brunswicker painting challenge.
Yeah.
That is something that, you know, Stephen in Australia mentioned, and I replied to a tweet of his online. So I'm in the UK, he's in Australia, we've never met each other, and yet, you know, somehow we've managed to, just the two of us, well, you know, picked up by the people very quickly. We just got a hashtag going, and we're doing stuff, and it's quite good fun around historical gaming. It's easy. But you just got to, you know, have a positive approach, I guess, and make things happen. If you sit there and wait things happen to you, then nothing's going to happen, right? This is what I say to my kids all the time. If you want to have good fun, go out there and find it, because it's, you know, it's there.
Well, thank you very much, Dad.
Now, Sydney, it must be past your bedtime.
Yeah. Well, I think that probably is. It's not past my bedtime. But
anyway, you're older than me. You're older than me, you cheeky bugger.
I don't look it though, darling.
I'm the baby of this bunch. Don't you forget it.
Well, as we fragment into internecine warfare, I think that's been a really good discussion. I think at the end of it, we would also say that just as much as we have our views, we're really interested to hear from gamers who may be younger than us as to, you know, what they might be looking for.
If there are any.
There's lots of lessons which, you know, we're keen to learn. It's not just, the traffic most definitely is not just from us to other people.
You might just have to speak up a bit so we can hear you.
That's right. My zipper.
So anyway, I think, you know, that is all for tonight. That is our big issue exhausted. Thank you for joining us. We will see you again for the next Oddcast. We have a few Oddcasts that we have planned. I slipped a reference to one of them in earlier in the show, so that's certainly something that we can look at bringing out during the course of the autumn or fall for our American listeners. But before I go, we should mention that Virtual Lard 3 is taking place on Saturday, the 3rd of October. Richard?
It certainly is. I was talking to young Jeremy today, who, if anybody's read my column in WSS Magazine or listened to Henry High's latest show on his Patreon channel, that you'd have heard Jeremy being interviewed there. And Jeremy said that the games are going out, entries, applications to join in the games on the 21st of September, the day I'll always remember. But he said, if you're not on the Discord server for that, just email him at virtuallard, one word, @gmail.com. So virtuallard@gmail.com, send Jeremy a message saying, I'd really be interested in joining in Virtual Lard 3, and he'll get you on the server. You can see the choice of games that's there, and then, you know, hopefully we can get you on board and playing. You've had a great time at the Virtual Lard 1 and 2, and I think this time is going to be a bumper crop of games, and hopefully gamers, a couple of games during the day and a few beers in the evening. So what's not to like?
Yeah, I think he's got around 14 games, has he? So I think that's 14 in the morning and 14 in the afternoon.
Yeah.
So 28
games.
28 sort of games by my maths to get involved with at least 4 people in each game.
Yeah,
So
five people in each game with the umpire. So we are talking about a lot of spaces, as somebody once said.
Yeah, and because it's virtual, it can get as big as it needs to get, I guess. I don't know what. I know he's trying to control it from just a management perspective, but
like wagon wheels.
Things online can get very big very quickly.
Well, on that bombshell, on that note, I think it's time for me to thank both Nick and to Richard and all of you for listening, and also to Roger Barraclough and the gang who are going to play us out as ever this evening. And as things go forward, if you're out there and starting to have gaming days and events, be they virtual or be they real, please do let us know and we can give you a shout out. But on that note, that's all for us shouting out tonight. I hope you have a very good evening and we'll see you again next time.
Cheers.
There's Obi-Wan, Ben Kenobi. I'm Ben Kenobi.
I'm shutting it down now.